Chapter 2 talks about gathering data. We're trying to get evidence. So that's what we're going to do in Chapter 2. We're going to get evidence. And just like if we were trying to collect it for a crime, we want to make sure that we haven't contaminated the evidence. We follow a good procedure. So they're always going to follow this procedure that's very exact. Because the data we get, whether you are running the study or myself, we want to make sure that it is accurate. It should be very close and match the population as best that we can. Let's just recall and review a few words here. A population is when we study the entire group. And that's pretty much impossible. We'll never be able to get everybody in our study. But if we were, we would come up with values that we're going to call a parameter. A parameter is a value calculated from the population. So this is very theoretical. We'll never know the population. But if we were able to and calculate a value, we'd call it a parameter. And if we were looking at people, they would be called or referred to as subjects. So even if on our sample and it was people, we would call them subjects. A parameter is fixed. What does that mean? It means it's not going to change. So if you were to look at the same population as me, and we figured out maybe the average age for your population, if you were using the same people that I would be using, would be fixed. It wouldn't change. We're going to assign that a letter, and these get confusing because you're going to get lots of little different symbols, so just keep track of them. We don't expect you to memorize those. But a population, again, is not realistic. So we're going to, in this class, that's what we call it statistics, we're going to look at samples. And a sample is a snapshot. I always think about this. If I was to look out, I'm in Montana, I look out and I take a picture at the same time of day, in the same place. I could take one to the east, sunny, to the north, rainy, and to the west, cloudy. And that would be at the same time of day, so you would never be able to know exactly what's happening. So if the whole sky was my population, I'm just getting a snapshot. And so you can see the snapshots could have a lot of differences. In fact, they could vary. And they're going to change from sample to sample. Even though you might be taking from the same sample, or the same population, as I will end up with different samples, so they'll have some variance. They'll vary a little bit. We don't want them to vary a lot, or we would have some sort of bias taking place. So they need to represent the population. And to help you remember that, if you just look, sample statistics, and that's what we call this class statistics, because we're looking at samples, because it's impossible to look at the population. The size of the sample is lowercase n. Notice n for number, capital N for the population, lowercase n for the size of the sample. Let's go down and look at some extra practice, and we'll come back and look at that word called variable. So here we're looking at some statistics, and I'll give you a second to look at that. Make sure you pause the video if I'm going too fast. It said that last month it interviewed all members of the labor force in a sample of 60,000. So the sample, it tells you right there, that's how many they looked at, so that's lowercase n. So they didn't measure everyone, even though it says all members. They measured all members of the sample of 60. So you have to be really careful about the verbiage here. And 6.2% of that sample that they interviewed was unemployed. So 6.2% would be considered the sample, which is a statistic. It's a measure from the sample, so we call it a statistic. Here's another example. We're looking at a telemarketing firm in LA. It dials a bunch of numbers, and if you take a look, it says 43 were unlisted, and 52% of all LA residents have unlisted numbers. So once I see the word all of the residents, they are referring to a population. So we're going to call this a parameter. So measure from the population, again, very unlikely to get. So if I look the first 100 numbers dialed, that's the number we looked at. Notice the lowercase n for the sample. 43 are unlisted, so 43 would be my statistic. Now, if you were to look at those 60,000, and if you were again to look at the first 100 numbers that you collected in your sample, you may come up with a different statistic. So why don't we use the population? Why are we stuck using the sample? It doesn't seem very accurate, but if we use a procedural way of collecting the sample, they will be different, but they'll be within a pretty close range of each other. Why don't we use a population though? Well, if you think about it, it's not accessible. Like we can't access it. Think about money. We want to be cheap. If we tried to look at everyone, we would spend our time trying to get everyone to respond. How many times have you hung up on a survey that you didn't want to answer? Okay, if we were doing a population, they would have to keep recalling you until you finally answered, or their study would not be valid. So that's why we use a sample. So let's go back and look at variable. And the variable is what is of interest. What are we looking for? Okay, what are we measuring? And if you remember from math, a variable means it's going to change. Okay, so the value that you get, the 6.2%, that is going to vary somewhat. So we just call it a variable. It's really, why is the study being conducted? And it all goes back to your hypothesis. What are you trying to measure? And that, what are you trying to measure, would be the variable. So in question number 2, we're looking at unlisted numbers. In question number 1, we're looking about unemployment. That would be our variable, unemployment, and then we would assign it the value that we received or calculated from our sample. There's a Let's Do It on page 88. The reference to this is found in the PDF at the beginning of chapter 2, so I encourage you to go back and look at that. And you might want to pause the video and go back and then check your answer, but I'm going to give the answers now. Here's A, and here is B. So again, this chapter is going to be a lot of vocabulary, not things you need to memorize, but things that you should probably have written and thought about. And you should notice too that they're kind of common words that you should have some idea about, like sample. Statistics probably not, but now you have that relationship between a sample and a statistic. So that's concluding the lecture number 1 for chapter